So this theory lecture is about the 12 principles of animation. And these are the 12 principles that were set down by Walt Disney's 9 old men back in the 30s and the 40s when they first started to establish the fundamentals of animation, which really haven't changed that much since then. And the 9 old men, just in case you don't know, were Disney's key animators. And he called them his 9 old men, partly because they were old and all of them were men, but it was a joke on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States during the war, who had 9 old men on the Supreme Court, and he called them the 9 old men because they were constantly blocking his attempts at legislative reform. So it was kind of a joke that Roosevelt had his 9 old men, and then Walt Disney had his 9 old men as well. And they wrote a book called The Illusion of Life, which was actually I'll just show you a copy of it here. There's The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, who were 2 of the old men. They're all now sadly dead. But their legacy lives on in this wonderful book that Frank and Ollie wrote, which is incredibly well worth buying. And although it's full of lots of anecdote and stories, it's also got an incredible amount of actual really hard information about how they made the Disney films back in the 30s and 40s and also later on. Here are Frank and Ollie, rather elderly with their wives here. And you can see here that these are the 12 principles. They are timing, spacing, squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead versus pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, slow ins and slow outs, arcs, also called path of action, secondary action, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. And you'll notice there are in fact 13 here, so it should be 12 principles plus 1, but 13 just doesn't feel like such a good number. And we'll go through these in turn, and really this is about establishing a kind of language of animation, because during the course I'll be referring to all of these principles, so it's important that you have a basic understanding of what they all mean. So here's the book, here's Frank and Ollie's book, which I highly recommend getting. And there's another book on this course that you definitely want to get, and that is the Animator's Survival Kit. This is actually the DVD box set, which you can also get, although it's rather more expensive than the book, but very, very good. But the book is much cheaper and incredibly useful, and it's really now the standard textbook for animation. Any serious student of animation needs to have this book. So let's begin with timing. Timing is how long it takes to complete an action. So a ball, like here's a ball bouncing, can bounce quickly. That would be fast timing, or it could bounce slowly. That would be slow timing. The spacing is the difference between the two poses. The ball might bounce with wide spacing. It might be a long distance between these 2 points, or a short way, small spacing. And as the ball slows down, the spacing is going to get smaller and smaller. And the spacing in the y-axis, that is to say the vertical axis, will also get smaller and smaller. In essence, all animation at its core is timing and spacing. Those are really the 2 key elements of animation. Timing, how long it takes to complete an action, spacing, the distance between 2 poses. Here's timing and spacing as expressed in the graph editor in Maya. Now, there's a separate lecture about the graph editor, which you should watch. But essentially, what the graph editor does is records the curves or the motion curves, which are the mathematical expressions of the motion of the object. In this case, we have a bouncing ball, and this is the green line here is the Y translation, which is to say the up and down motion. Security there. So the up and down motion is this expressed as this green line here, and the timing of the action is here 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. This is the amount of time that the action is taking, and the value in the y-axis is the distance it's traveling. So this green line is literally recording how high the ball bounces, and that's why the bouncing ball exercise is such a good exercise to begin with, because it helps you understand in the graph editor what's going on. Okay, so timing. This is taken from The Illusion of Life. This is an idea. This is a sort of exploration of how long it takes to do certain actions. And with time, as an animator, you get more experience with this, and you learn how to um, you learn instinctively how long it takes to time things out. In the beginning, you're going to need a stopwatch or to count things off 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000 like this in order to get a feeling for how long things take. So the question, how long does it take for an action to take, is really something that you acquire with practice. And as you go through the course, you will get better and better at doing this. Some animators become real masters of timing. Here's a clip from Disney's Aladdin, and this is all animation done by Eric Goldberg, who's one of the great geniuses of animation, one of the great living geniuses. He wrote an excellent book called Character Animation Crash Course, which I also highly recommend. And Eric is really the master of fast timing. And this sequence of the Aladdin and the genie and the lamp, I highly recommend you watch it. It is amazing what Eric gets away with and the incredibly fast transformations that he manages to pull off. And that's because he's completely mastered timing and animation. Here's an advert done at my father's studio in the 1970s, one of my favorites, the Jovan commercial based on the artwork of Frank Frazetta. Very popular illustrator, and there's some incredibly rapid transitions happening here when the lightning strikes the warrior hero's sword, and incredibly fast timing, but nonetheless it works very, very well. If you watch the old Warner Brothers cartoons, you'll see that Chuck Jones, who is the great Warner Brothers director, pretty much invented the very, very snappy, fast Warner Brothers timing. Here you can see the legs on the Roadrunner are going around so fast we can't even see them. Really, really fast timing. So the second principle is squash and stretch. And here we're really talking about compression, that is to say squash when the ball hits the ground, and then extension or stretch when the ball is bouncing up again. So we're assuming this is a pretty flexible ball. And we've got squash, that is to say compression, and stretch, that is to say extension. And in real life, things are squashing and stretching all the time. Here's the same thing closer up. Here's a tennis ball flying through the air, stretching out as it comes to the ground, squashing as it hits the ground. And here is an example from some Disney stuff from the 1920s. Very, very broad squash and stretch on this character. Kind of crazy squash and stretch. Quite difficult to do this in CG, though it's getting easier now as CG models and rigs become more and more sophisticated. Here's a mouse from The Country Cousin, animated by the great animator Art Babbitt. This is also taken from The Illusion of Life. And you can see how much Art is squashing and stretching the mouse's face here as he chews. The mouse is drunk here. So there's a lot of exaggerated squash and stretch. Here's some squash and stretch from Cliff Nordberg, who was one of the great Disney animators from the 50s. He was in charge of training. And you can see this very, very exaggerated squash and stretch on this man as he chews here. And this was devised by Nordberg as a training exercise for young animators. So they would take these thumbnail poses and then turn them into animation. Another example of Nordberg, here's more squash and stretch on a man jumping. Again, very, very broad changes in the action. This also shows some arcs and overlapping action, which we'll come on to in a minute. Anticipation. This is another important principle. Anticipation is really where you are essentially preparing the audience for an even larger action. Here, this Oswald the Rabbit, that was Disney's first character that he created before Mickey even. He's anticipating here. He's reaching into his trousers, apparently, and pulling something out. So this motion here is an anticipation for the action, which is the reveal of whatever it is that he's just pulled out of his pants. Here's the same thing with a ball throw. You've got a character throwing a ball. These are done by Tracy Chung, one of my ex-students, very, very talented Tracy. Here's the anticipation on the character throwing the ball. The action as the character throws the ball, and then the reaction afterwards. Almost everything in animation can be divided up like this. Anticipation, action, and then reaction. Anticipation here again. Here's a nice image of Donald Duck. He's kind of drawing back towards screen left. He's anticipating. We know where he's going to go. We know he's going to exit screen right. You don't even need to animate him screen right, or maybe you just need 1 or 2 frames at most to get him out. But we know because he's anticipating to screen left that the only place he has to go is to screen right. Now, we're about halfway through this video. I'm just going to close out here, and then in the second video, pick up the rest of the explanation of the 12 principles of animation.